The Ladykillers is a really good example of how colour is used in kind of Ealing's late colour period. It's one of the last 3 films made in colour at the studio. Otto Heller, who was the cinematographer, and director Alexander McKendrick obviously wanted to use colour to inform some of the themes of the film, which traditionally are around kind of a traditional approach to life, which is Mrs. Wilberforce, and the newer, modern version of Britain, which is represented by the gang. What's interesting with McKendrick and Heller is they very much wanted to try and control colour. They felt that if you were not careful, colour could get out of control and dominate, and therefore get in the way of the comedy and the story they wanted to tell. It's clear in the film that certain key sequences again use colour, harking back to that idea of Douglas Slocum's, where colour could be used in precise moments. In the Ladykillers particularly, there's 2 sequences. One is the use of the red telephone box during the commission of the crime. I mean, here, you know, the Guinness is in the phone box talking to the Major over the phone, and all the other characters are kind of clustered around it, desperate to know what's happening. The phone box there, you know, very much a symbol of modernity and kind of modern communication, or miscommunication in the case of the gang later on. Perhaps more interestingly is the sequence in the house itself. Mrs. Wilberforce's house is quite a grotesque, gothic location in the film, and is often shot in quite shadowy, expressionistic ways. Within the house, though, a lot of the downstairs set is very kind of pastel in tone. It's lots of whites and creams, and very few colours stand out. And this was clearly part of what McKendrick and Heller wanted. When you go to the rooms that the professor rents in the house, the first room is a kind of a dark green colour where they practice. But the room beyond that, where the gang plan their crime, is a much kind of stronger red colour with, again, some quite sickly tones of green. And in many sequences, when they're in the outer room, you can still see a shot through the door into the room beyond, which kind of pulses a strange, sickly red-green colour. And it's clear that the use of the room, the kind of gang's location in the house, is a sense that that's their space. That their space is not the calm pastel world of Mrs. Wilberforce, but a much kind of stronger, slightly more gothic space where they kind of commit their crimes and also plan to kill Mrs. Wilberforce once she discovers their scheme.
How about suicide?
What do you mean?
Well, get her to write a note, you know. I just couldn't stand it no more. Sign Mrs. Wilberforce, and then somebody goes down and hangs her.
Very funny.
You got a better idea?
The colour red is important throughout the film. It crops up in key sequences. Not only is the room where the gang plan their crime a very deep, kind of vibrant red tone, which is very different to the rest of the house, but red crops up in kind of key location props throughout the film. So we have the red train carriages, which we see towards the end of the gang's crime as it's committed. We also see the red phone box, which is very important for communication when the gang are committing their crime. And perhaps most importantly, the red of the train signal at the end of the film ends with the professor leaning over, presuming he's been the victor and has won the money, ends with the red signal coming down, whacking him on the head, and he falls off onto the train tracks below. It's clearly another sign where kind of communication, modern technology eventually outwits the professor. And is another example where the red colours are very strong and kind of a key element in completing that part of the narrative. It was often easier to use Technicolor in the studio to guarantee the kind of colours you were going to be able to capture on camera. But in the Ladykillers, as in other 1950s films, the kind of shift to more location work meant that particular locations would have to be repainted or built specifically to get the effect that the production team were after. In the case of the King's Cross locations, they offer quite a naturalistic tone, but it does mean that the red phone boxes and the red train carriages tend to stand out more against those kind of naturalistic colours. So the cinematographer Otto Heller had a background working in British cinema, particularly in expressionistic kind of film noir, in films such as They Made Me a Fugitive. He'd made a couple of colour films before doing the Ladykillers, and it's clear in the Ladykillers that he and McKendrick wanted to bring some of that expressionistic tone over. to again use shadows to suggest the kind of gothic undertones of the film. In this instance, what that often looks like is around particular key characters. So when the Professor first appears, he's kind of bathed in shadows as he comes to Mrs. Wilberforce's door. Other characters are presented in the same way, and throughout the film, particularly as the film moves into nighttime and the characters try to bump off Mrs. Wilberforce in different ways, those kind of darker, shadowy tones begin to dominate more. It seems clear that Heller's background, using those kind of expressionistic ideas, made him a key contributor for the Ladykillers.
I understand you have rooms to let.
Oh, the rooms, yes. Won't you come in, please?
Thank you. My name is Marcus.
How do you do, Mr. Marcus?
Professor Marcus.
Oh, how do you do, Professor? Yes, I have two right yes. Would you excuse me a moment while I put this away, please?
Key locations within the film, notably Mrs. Wilberforce's house, are essential to be captured in colour. Again, the kind of shift from a more kind of pastel tone as we're first introduced to the location, through what then happens as the gang arrive, the colours of their room suggesting their kind of their status, and then as the film darkens and as it moves into nighttime, the tones of the film take on a very different, darker hue, bringing out again those kind of expressionistic ideas. I think just the colour really deepens the kind of ideas and the themes that McKendrick and Heller were keen to bring out.
Shine upon my love today.
Audiences in Britain were used to Technicolor largely through American releases here, so the likes of Wizard of Oz, Adventures of Robin Hood. There were British films made in Technicolor in the 1930s, particularly Wings of the Morning in sort of 1936-37. But it's the 1940s when British film production does more Technicolor productions with films like Henry V, A Matter of Life and Death, The Red Shoes. So really in that period, that's when we see more British films made in colour. But even then, they're made in quite small numbers because black and white still dominates. Ealing moved into colour with Saraband for Dead Lovers in 1948 and Scott of the Antarctic also in 1948, both very prestigious, high-quality dramas that fitted into the mould that British cinema was using at that time. Lots of British films in colour chose well-known subjects or period subjects so that they could make use of the colour to make quite extravagant, spectacular-looking films. Ealing borrowed some of that approach for Saraband for Dead Lovers, which mixes a more kind of expressionistic approach to colour with the kind of novelty and spectacle in certain sequences where colour really comes to the fore. Common black and white production would use one strip of film, so filming in Technicolor required 3 times the amount of film stock, and that obviously increased the cost to the production. As well as that, all cameras had to be rented from Technicolor, and Technicolor was in charge of all the processing, and they also insisted on having a colour consultant on set for all British productions. Ealing's colour aesthetic was largely formed by cinematographer Douglas Slocum. He worked on Saraband for Dead Lovers, having worked on several Ealing films before that. It was Douglas Slocum working with production designer Michael Relf who created the initial idea of what Saraband could look like, so this kind of period spectacle, but also using very kind of expressionistic, shadowy colours and often drenching scenes in what Slocum called Technicolor black. He was kind of much more interested in the blacks and the darker hues of Technicolor than the bright primary colours found in particularly American productions. Slocum often described colour as being something which had to be used carefully, but which could bring scenes to life and could add to character psychology and to narrative, rather than being a kaleidoscope of colours, which he felt American productions often were. Because Douglas Slocum adopted a very kind of expressionistic approach to Saraband, Ealing would use some of that in their later 1950s colour films, particularly something like The Ladykillers, which has a particular expressionistic tone to it. Elsewhere, I think Slocum's use of colour, and particularly around key sequences, so in Saraband for Dead Lovers, it's the Hanover Fair sequence, in which colour explodes across the screen in all the different colours imaginable. And it's clear that that was designed to be a key moment where colour could be shown off. And again, in later Ealing films, such as the Titfield Thunderbolt, there are moments where colour really comes to the fore. In Thunderbolt particularly, it's the moment where the slightly darker original train is replaced by a gloriously restored train, which is all resplendent in kind of reds and greens. So again, key moments where colour would really come to the fore in the narrative were very much driven by Slocum's approach to colour in Saraband.
Careful, boys! Careful! Hey, wait a minute! Careful now, slowly! Don't bumper! Don't bumper! Hold it a minute, hold it! Come on!
Around a quarter of Ealing's output in the 1950s was in colour. They made around 40 films, of which 11 were in colour. So it became quite a significant part of their output and their production plans. Ealing were well known for what was called a kind of a drama documentary approach, particularly realistic ideas which developed during wartime. Post-war, Michael Balkin, the head of the studio, was eager for Ealing to expand and try new things, and colour was part of that, as well as moving into different genres. Obviously the Ealing comedies are perhaps the thing they're best known for, and here again there's a mix of colour and black and white approaches taken, whereas we would look at something like The Man in the White Suit as an example of a really strong expressionistic black and white. So Ealing's approach in the 1950s was still to kind of draw on their realist roots, but also to add in kind of new versions and new nuances to that. So you get a film like The Love Lottery, which is filmed in colour, which is much more about kind of stardom and is filmed in much more exotic locations in Italy, rather than perhaps the more kind of down-to-earth British films that Ealing was known for at the time. I think Ealing's colour films are often overlooked in favour of their black and white, simply because the black and white realism is what Ealing was best known for. If you think of their comedies, the ones that are best known are their black and white comedies, Passport to Pimlico, Man in the White Suit, Kind Hearts and Coronets. Their wartime films are very well known, but also their 1950s films like The Blue Lamp and The Cruel Sea are kind of really good examples of kind of black and white films from that period. So the colour films aren't ignored, but they tend not to be as well known. I think Ealing is willing to push the boundaries. They make horror films, they make comedies, they make melodramas, they make period dramas. They're not kind of that safe, realist studio that kind of exists in people's imaginations. I understand that, there's a real sense that that's what Ealing does. I think the colour films are a chance to understand that Ealing was willing to take risks. They moved into widescreen in the 1950s with most of the rest of British cinema, but they're also willing to experiment with the process Technorama, which came along in the late 1950s for the film Davy with Harry Seacombe. And while that film, again, is often overlooked, it's a great example of both the use of widescreen, but also their use of colour, given that, again, Douglas Slocum's ideas around using colour expressionistically really come to play in that film when the character visits the Royal Opera House. And again, the kind of screen is filled with red colours of the curtains and the seats, but also the character is kind of lost amid kind of the black shadows as he kind of moves into that huge kind of voluminous space. So it's really interesting that Ealing's willing to experiment in different ways across this period. And although the studio would stop producing films in the late 50s, they were still willing to experiment right up until the end.